Hi, my name's Kienan and welcome to my talk today. I'm here to talk to you today about some of my PhD research, which has focused on the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone. And the question I would like to answer today is brine disposal responsible for induced seismicity in this region? And just a little bit of background, probably the most significant earthquake in this area happened in August of 2014, and there was an earthquake that was magnitude 4.1. And it was significant enough that it actually knocked out power to the region for a couple of hours and caused a nearby gas plant to shut down and had to flare gas. So it is the kind of thing that affects people's everyday lives. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that later on. So just to situate you in the study area, the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone is located just south of the town of Rocky Mountain House in west central Alberta. It's also south of the Ochise and Sunchild Cree Indian Reserves. It's a northwest to southwest oriented pod of earthquakes that's centered in Township 37, Range 9 west of 5. And it's a little unique in Alberta, first of all, for being one of the oldest known induced earthquake clusters, as well as having a poroelastic mechanism that is purported to be the cause of most of this earthquake activity. So what I mean by that is, what's happening in this region, so this cross-section from A to B going northwest to southwest, there is a significant Leduc sour gas pool that's located at depth, and this was, of course, discovered in the late 60s, and what's happened here is the production of gas from this carbonate unit caused the faults that were located deeper in the subsurface to be released because of the mass change. So in a bit of a relief to most of those who live in the area, seismicity in this region was thought to be on the decline. As you can see from this chart, which is adapted from Stern et al. 2013, so we've got the gas production from this pool in red over time, which is declining, versus the number of earthquake events that were recorded by the national and provincial networks. And you'll notice that the shape of these curves is relatively similar, so which is the reason they thought they were related. So they were thought to be on the decline. What's interesting, though, is if we look at the more recent distribution of earthquakes across Alberta, so here we're just looking in west central Alberta, west of Red Deer's over here, Rocky Mountain House again is here. If we look at the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone, we can see that there has been a fair bit of earthquake activity post-2006. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the rise in induced seismicity across Alberta is strongly linked to the increased amount of hydraulic fracturing that's occurring. However, there's no hydraulic fracturing operations that are happening in Rocky Mountain House, but the gas production has supposedly stopped. So something else is going on. So if we take that same graph and extend it past 2006 and into 2022, we can see that there's actually been an increase in the number of earthquakes, particularly after 2013. And what's particularly concerning is there's been 3 events that were larger than magnitude 3 that occurred after 2014. So in 2014, 2020, there was 2 other earthquakes. And prior to that time, the largest earthquakes had occurred in 1996. So something has changed. And what we've sought out to try and answer is what is controlling the increase in seismicity in this region. So just to situate you from a geologic perspective, imagine yourself in Alberta in the late Devonian, which was a great time to be a reef-building organism. Alberta was covered in a shallow sea that was great for reef formation, and if we zoom in on the province of Alberta, what we'll see is there's a number of reefs that stretch across the province, and the Strachan Reef, which is located about here, is where the Rocky Mountain House cluster is now thought to be related to. So that pool was first discovered in 1967, and it's a carbonate buildup that's relatively large. And what's important to note from this net pay map, which I've added here, is that there's sort of 2 separate reefs that are present here that are dipping towards the northwest, towards the Rocky Mountain Folded Thrust Belt. And what we find is that the eastern portion of the reef is largely dolomitized, whereas the northwestern end is not. So the reason I talked about Devonian reef formation is that basement faults are often invoked by carbonate sedimentologists as a way to explain the location of reefs across the entire province into so-called monadnock buildups during the Devonian, because these basement faults may have created sort of pop-up structures which allowed for these reefs to be closer to the sun and therefore preferentially grew there. And by extension, having these faults there provided fluid pathways for hydrothermal fluids to dolomitize the reservoir, create porosity. And what Schultz and Corlett found is that the distance to Devonian reef margins actually correlates very well and is statistically significant with some clusters, and particularly in Rocky Mountain House and Brazeau. However, it's very difficult to actually see direct evidence of these faults. So the best evidence is these faults being located below the Devonian. So for example, this is from that Schultz paper again, and they located a number of earthquakes below the Leduc, which is in this sort of orangey color. A number of the earthquakes in the Rocky Mountain House region were located deeper than the reservoir. So again, we see that there's more earthquakes from a variety of different types that occur closer to reef margins than not. So if we take the location of, just as an example, the Leduc reefs, which are indicated in this sort of this pinkish color, and we plot that over top of where we find earthquakes specifically in the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zones. If we zoom in much further than we had previously, and of course I've got the wells plotted on here in green, and you'll want to remember the location of this 10 of 30 well just on the edge of this pool, and we'll come back to that later. And what we find is that there is some spatial association, especially when we look at earthquakes from 2000 until 2020, when we have some more earthquake monitoring stations available. We see that the margins of these reefs in purple is relatively close to where these earthquakes are located. And if you can get a sense of where these earthquakes are occurring in time because I've colored the earthquake hypercenters based on the year that they occurred. So kind of more darker is further into the past, and more into that orangey yellow warmer colors is closer to today. So coming back to this chart, what becomes clear is that something temporarily occurred after 2013. Now, of course, there were more stations that have been installed throughout the province of Alberta, although there's even been a slight increase in the number of larger earthquakes, which is also concerning. So it's not just a sensitivity issue. So I sought out to try and find out what happened in 2013 or after 2013 to cause this reactivation of earthquake activity. So being a geologist, one of the first things I did is I looked into the production and injection history at this particular pool. Got the gas production here in red. I've got the cumulative produced water in the cyan color, and finally the amount of injected water in this darker blue. And something I was struck by is of course, this is a very prolific pool, but I was also struck by the volume of water that's been injected into this reservoir. So 52.3 million barrels of water over the course of the last 50 or so years. And that is not a trivial volume. And what was interesting to me is this particular if you look at about 2013, there's this big blip in the water production. So I tried to look into that a little bit more. And so what happened here? And what I've included here is a focal mechanism that was generated from the earthquake that happened in August of that year, which was a magnitude 3.8. And this was a reverse fault that was oriented relatively the same as the fold-in thrust belt. So if we now look at a structural cross-section from west to east from the 10 of 30 well, which I previously mentioned, which is a active waste disposal well, and going east towards one of the original now abandoned gas producers, what you see, of course, is you've got this thicker Ireton shale, which sits on top of the thinner section of Leduc that's there. And then, of course, we have this big, thick section of Wabamun. And something I found fascinating is not only has this well been injecting in the Leduc for a long time, what I was also intrigued by was these two jet perforations in the Devonian Wabamun, which is also a carbonate. And I initially assumed that the wastewater injection was purely limited to the Leduc formation. But in 2013, so this well and another one switched injection zones uphole to the Wabamun formation, which is stratigraphically higher. So the timing of this was very convenient and a little suspicious to me, so I decided to look into this a little bit more. So coming back to that same graph again, where we've of course got the gas production and the earthquake activity, if we now plot that same graph against the volume of water that was injected into the Leduc over time, we can see that there's been a large volume of water injected into the Leduc, and of course in 2013, as I previously mentioned, this new injection horizon was initiated, so that's shown here in purple. So what do we know about how induced seismicity occurs? We need three things. You need stress changes, so how that could be occurring here is through the brine injection. We've got potentially some pathways for pore pressure diffusion through indirectly shown by the dolomitization of both of these horizons. And finally, we also know that this is in the fold and thrust belt, so it's very possible that there are critically stressed faults that are already present. So just for a quick structure refresh, because I know not everyone here is a structural geologist and neither am I, here's just a plan view look at what some of the structures you can see in the subsurface and a cross-section as you go from the Rocky Mountains east towards the Central Plains, which are, of course, less deformed. And if you look at the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone, which I've indicated here with this red circle, it's sort of in this transition zone between two structural styles. So from A to A prime, we've got the fold and thrust belt, and then what's called a triangle zone here. And then east of Rocky Mountain House, you don't really see nearly as much deformation and foreshortening. Whereas if we look from B to B prime, you don't have a triangle zone at all. You still have these expressions of thrusting that come out all the way to the surface, but you don't have nearly as much going on kind of in this sort of region. And what Lee et al. 2018 showed is that as you go laterally across the fold and thrust belt, you have these sorts of changes in structural style which are related to the mechanical stratigraphy. So the relative brittleness of some of these layers, as well as if you possibly have any buttresses, like stiffer buttresses that are located deeper in the subsurface. And what's interesting is that the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone, there's not a lot of structure that's clear from the seismic, so gotta look a little bit closer. But before we do that, we zoom out and look at the overall study area. What we can see if you plot these broad structural domains, which are quite generalized, if we plot the edge of the Mesozoic deformation front, which of course is we now see is on the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountain House seismogenic zone, and the Paleozoic deformation fronts, and then go back into the McConnell thrust, you see that there's sort of three broad structural domains. We have these areas of earthquake activity which are closer to the mountains, and then you have a lot less outboard of that, other than this particular area here. Of course, it is possible that some of this earthquake activity in Rocky Mountain House is natural, but what's useful is that you can discriminate natural earthquakes from induced ones via how deep they are. So natural earthquakes are typically much deeper, whereas induced ones would be shallower. And if you can also establish some sort of correlation with another process like an injection activity, or if you're removing gas from the reservoir, that's another way to link it to human activity. So in order to establish a possible correlation between the injection and the earthquake activity, first we needed a way to do that. So how do we compare two different time series, especially two that don't look very similar? And if you're familiar with the concept of cross-correlation compares how similar two time series are over time, given a certain delay or lag. So what this animation here is showing is the first time series in blue, and as you shift the second time series G, the cross-correlation coefficient varies based on how much they overlap in time. So, but what you can also do is Teleska developed this random shuffling test where you can determine the confidence intervals of how sure you are that they're actually the same by running it like over many thousands of times. So Teleska, along with Schultz, developed this program called Reshuffle Core, which Dave has assured me is very easy to use. It's freely available from GitHub if you feel like playing with it. You basically need two time series that are well filtered and demeaned. And so what we did is we applied this reshuffle core test to the Wabamun ejection, as well as the earthquake counts within a 40-kilometer radius in order to jive with the work that Stern had done in 2013. So, of course, no injection prior to 2013, and then a lot of activity. Whereas the earthquake counts, of course, there are a few earthquakes that occurred prior to 2013, but then we see there is an uptick here. And now I agree that these two curves don't look very similar. However, when you run this reshuffle core test where you're plotting these two curves against each other and randomly sampling them in such a way that you're keeping the same power spectrum of both time series, you can establish the same sort of time lag. The blue curve here is the time lag that was calculated. The pink line is the 99% confidence interval. And any point that the blue line exceeds the pink is a point where we are 99% sure that there is some sort of relationship between these two processes, and that occurs at about 3 months. And because this exceeds that 99% confidence interval, we are confident that this relationship is statistically significant. And something else that's useful to note here, because I'm aware that the cross-correlation coefficients for this relationship are relatively low, so lower than 0.3. The 40-kilometer cutoff, which is used by Stern, is quite broad and extends much further than the extent of the majority of the cluster. So I believe that if we filtered this down, we could get we could probably remove a lot of the noise from this data set, particularly for including earthquakes that have nothing to do with this seismicity. So another good example of where this has been employed before was in the Musreau Lake field, which is located much further north, closer to Fox Creek, where several wastewater injection wells were definitively linked to induced seismicity through using the same reshuffle core test. So they were able to establish that there was a 3-month lag, again about the same, between the initiation of wastewater injection and the timing of the earthquakes happening. So in terms of a model for what's going on, I've included a structural cross-section that goes from west to east across the D3A pool. And what I'm trying to show here is that there are zones of the Wabamun and the Leduc which are variably dolomitized. They're not dolomitized everywhere, and the regions that are must have had some sort of porous and permeable pathway for which hydrothermal fluids were able to flow. So when this zone was accessed by the injection and the perforations, this pumped fluid and pressurized this particular zone, which then was able to transfer that stress down some of these faults and deeper into the basement. So I'm suggesting that there's likely some faults which have very little to do with the poroelastic seismicity that was being triggered before, and is a completely separate hydrologic system. And there's actually precedence for this too in Alberta. So in Cardston, Alberta, there was a paper published in 2018 which showed that hydraulic fracturing in this region accessed paleokarst dissolution-related faults in the Wabamun. So the dissolution is shown in these kind of blue linear features, and fracking these allowed these earthquakes to happen. So what do we know and what's next? I would encourage people not to underestimate the significance and potential risk of brine disposal in Canada. It's much better understood in the States. Most importantly, recent seismicity in the Rocky Mountain House region is linked to Wabamun brine disposal, particularly shown by the statistical correlation with the injection, and it has a lag time of about 3 months. I also plan to investigate other associations, such as by refiltering with a smaller radius. I'd also like to look into the relationship between earthquakes and previous gas production, and then also establish a relationship between how close these earthquakes are to the reef boundaries that are here. I'd also like to do some more mapping and determine the extent of dolomitization in both the Wabamun and the Leduc in order to help with this fault mapping. And I'm also interested in the southern pool, which is the Racinus West field, where very similar injection activity is occurring and should be looked into. So thanks for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.